All right. Hello, and thank you for logging on to the first adult summer reading event for the series, Imagine Your Story. This presentation is called Montana Conversations, Storytelling and Public Lands. My name is Sarah Creech. I am the Adult Services Librarian for the Belgrade Community Library, and just wanted to share a little bit about the event today and give you a little background on John before we get started. So this event is sponsored by the Belgrade Community Library Foundation and presented with Humanities Montana. If you're interested in signing up for the Humanities Montana monthly email or the library's monthly newsletter, let me know. As a reminder for all the participants, I will be emailing out a survey afterwards that you'll have as soon as possible. Please reply and give me your answers. But that will help Humanities Montana continue with their excellent programming and get feedback directly from you. And then a little background on why this series is called Imagine Your Story. The Collaborative Summer Learning Program works with libraries to create inclusive literacy-based programs with a unified theme that's enjoyable for all ages. In the past, the Belgrade Community Library has put together a very robust series of programs for families and children, all meant to beat the summer slide for kids over the summer. September through May is very full of adult programming here at the library, and this theme inspired us to bring more adult learning opportunities to the Belgrade area. And when we ask you to imagine your story, we want you to think about what stories you tell over and over again. And for this specific program, how public lands might tie in. We all know public lands are really important to Montanans, evidenced by Bozeman passing the creation of a Parks and Trails tax district, in the middle of the stay-at-home order due to the coronavirus. So just think about what stories you tell and how you want to incorporate public lands while John speaks. And now a little bit about our presenter. John Clayton is a nonfiction writer who is particularly drawn to the intersection of history, nature, and culture. His book, Wonderlandscape, Yellowstone National Park and the Evolution of an American Cultural Icon, won the High Plains Book Award. His previous books include The Cowboy Girl, The Life of Caroline Lockhart, and Stories from Montana's Enduring Frontier. He often writes for Montana Quarterly and Big Sky Journal, among other magazines. And this presentation draws from his latest book, Natural Rivals, John Muir and Gifford Pinchot, and the Creation of America's Public Lands. The Belgrade Library does own Wonderlandscape and Natural Rivals, and will soon own the other two. And if you're interested in borrowing them, you can place a hold through our online catalog. The library is currently open from 10 to 2, Monday through Friday, with curbside pickup during those hours until 7 on Monday and Wednesday, and until 6, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. So I will keep an eye on the chat box during John's initial presentation, keeping note of any questions that come up. Make sure you stay muted for the first part, and then when John opens it up for discussion, we'll start with the questions that come up through the chat. So if you can't find the chat, it's just at the bottom of whatever screen you're looking at. There's a little, voice box icon, and you can ask questions to everyone or just directly to me. And I'm listed as Belgrade Library, and I will keep track of those. So I'm gonna share the hosting responsibility with John, and he will start sharing his screen.
Thanks, Sarah. Actually, let me just talk at you for a minute before I share my screen. I'm so delighted to be joining you folks in Belgrade tonight. We originally set this up before the pandemic hit, and I was looking forward to seeing people in person and having that nice drive from Red Lodge over to Belgrade in this green June. But we're able to do this on Zoom. This is my actual first time presenting on Zoom, so please bear with me. If you have any recommendations for how I can present better, feel free to let me know. I like to run a fairly informal presentation when I can, and to the extent that the technology will support us for that. So let me see, share the screen. It's coming up now. Here we go. As Sarah mentioned, what I want to talk about is the relationship between storytelling and public lands. And I want to do it based on some of the research that I did for my last two books, Wonder Landscape and Natural Rivals. And let's see if I can get the screen to advance. There we go. I live in Red Lodge. I've been here almost 30 years. I love everything about the town. The natural landscape, the people, the culture, etc. And I'm very fortunate to be able to work with words full-time, writing books, magazine articles, and I also do some writing for corporations. What I realized when I arrived in Red Lodge in my early 20s was that I wanted to live here and I wanted to work with words full-time for a living if I could do that. It was more fun, more entertaining than anything else I was qualified to do. And so how could I do that? I mean, some people work for newspapers, some people have other ways of incorporating words into their lives. My path took me first to Fromberg, Montana, and this is a picture of Fromberg. Everyone familiar with Fromberg? It's about 20, 30 miles south of Billings, very small town in the Clarks Fork Valley there. Probably in the early 90s, it was the smallest town in the country to have a software company with more than 10 employees headquartered there. And they needed somebody to write documentation of their software, to explain to users how to use software. The software was actually a library management system. And so it could be that, that Sarah, your predecessors there might have probably not been using this system. But anyways, I was learning all about MARC records and all of the details of library management in order to explain to people how to use the software. Back in the 90s, when software wasn't all that common, it took a lot of hand-holding to help people through. And so that hand-holding had to happen through the written form because we didn't have web pages, much less videos to help explain things. After Fromberg, I got a job in Helena in the IBM building there. In the center of that picture, I was working for a software company that was working for the state fund, the workers' comp software fund, again, explaining how to do things. Some of you may remember how unpopular the state fund was in the 90s, and we were trying to help by making it run more smoothly with software, and I was trying to help by explaining whether that worked or not. Sort of boring, but a great chance for me to compose sentences all day long. I started working more and more remotely. I would go to Helena for a day or a week, a month maybe, and then do the rest of my work in Red Lodge as the internet evolved. And so the company finally started having me work remotely out of their headquarters in Denver and servicing their clients around the country. Various insurance companies, again, really boring but fun way to write. And then eventually I was able to get a gig with Microsoft. And so this is a picture of Seattle. And again, I was working remotely from Red Lodge, writing stories of people using software. It's really, I really learned a lot from Microsoft. There's a reason that they're such a big and successful company. They had a strict formula for everything I wrote. At this point, I'd shifted over more into marketing. And so I was telling stories of people who had been happy with their Microsoft purchase as a way of encouraging other people to purchase Microsoft software. And Microsoft insisted that every story had to have a hero, and the hero was not anyone at Microsoft, the hero was the customer. And the customer faced a problem, and the customer would solve that problem by purchasing Microsoft software. And we would go through, I wrote hundreds of case studies of how customers had succeeded through this storytelling formula. And I had it ingrained in me enough that I've been able to apply this formula to be able to write things that I find more interesting: history, culture, nature. And so the books and magazine articles that I've been writing for the last 15 years or so. And so that formula, again, the storytelling formula always starts with a hero. The hero overcomes an obstacle. If it's a long story, he or she overcomes multiple obstacles in reaching a goal. This goes back at least as far as Beowulf, the first written, recorded story in Northern European traditions. What was it, 800s or so? Beowulf was needed to kill a dragon. He was a hero who had a goal of killing the dragon, and he kept running across all of these obstacles on his way to kill the dragon, but eventually killed the dragon and accomplished his goal. And so we see this formula furthermore playing out across every sort of superhero movie, every sort of other kind of movie or video game or novel. That storytelling formula: hero, obstacle, overcomes the obstacle, achieves the goal. Sometimes overcoming one obstacle leads to another obstacle, and then you have to overcome that. And Star Wars is great at that, or Lord of the Rings. Oh my God! And now we got to figure out this thing. But in at least in the Northern European traditions, this storytelling formula is gold. And so I'm especially thrilled to be part of your storytelling summer here, because as I've been thinking about storytelling through my career, this is the big thing I've learned. Our stories work best when we put them in this formula. Our stories sort of connect with people. They connect with ourselves. We are able to feel good about our stories when we tell those stories with a hero overcoming obstacles and achieving a goal. Maybe that hero is our child or grandchild. Maybe that hero is ourselves. Maybe that hero is someone we admire. But it's very helpful, I think, both in terms of your personal growth and in terms of accomplishing your goals, to be thinking about storytelling in this format. The other example, of course, politicians are often describing themselves with these formats. I was a hero. I overcame certain obstacles in order to achieve the goal of bringing you whatever policies you need. So, and of course, I just did it as well myself. I described myself as a hero who had a goal of being able to work with words all day long. And I overcame obstacles. How is it that I can be good at this job? And who can teach me in these various software companies? Who can teach me? Unfortunately, a lot of them were really small, and I didn't have a lot of mentors, had to figure it out by myself. I could overcome these obstacles and eventually achieve my goal of being able to write books and magazine articles that seem to resonate with at least a few people. And so, yay, I've achieved my goal. I often hate talking so much about myself, but it was a great example of this storytelling formula. So let me pause there. And if you have any questions or comments about storytelling in general, we can sort of talk about stories, talk about my story, your story. This is a good point for audience interaction if you want to turn off your mute and comment, or else we'll just move forward. Let me pause. Okay, I'm not hearing anyone speak up yet.
Sarah? Oh, yeah.
I'll say something. Sorry, I had to change my screen. So I'm interested in writing. I'm not sure what format I would like to, eventually publish something or that kind of thing. Would you say it mattered? I hear, write something every day, or, write just to write kind of thing. And would it matter? Like if I write in my journal, that kind of thing, or write letters or different things. I mean, what does it matter, would you say, the kinds of things you write if you don't have an end goal on what you want to write?
In my opinion, and lots of opinions vary, the answer is both yes and no. Yes, it matters because it's really helpful to write the kinds of things that you want to write. And as I was writing these explanations of software procedures, that wasn't terribly exciting, but it was nonfiction, it was explanatory. And so it was good preparation for me to write books that are nonfiction that have a bit of explaining to them. And it was, the point I have often made to students is it's really valuable to include narrative storytelling, even in your explanations. And so this was sort of the lesson that I've learned as I've just been explaining. On the other hand, especially if you don't have a genre in mind, I think it's great to just be writing anything. I've got 2 or 3 dozen spiral notebooks full of, it started as travel journals, and eventually I would sort of just noodle around with essay ideas, and then I would, write down more diary entry type things. And they're all a mixture of just stuff I wanted to write. Sometimes it's research notes, it's the beginnings of how an essay might be structured or how a book might start. Wonder Landscape, I started, I wrote the first 5 paragraphs of that book in my notebook while I was on vacation in southern Utah back 8-10 years ago. And I was just so excited. Finally, I'd been researching this for so long, and I was writing, and I just knew that this was the way the book had to start. I'd found my voice by noodling around and not really writing anything with any goal. Ironically, once I got the book done, those 5 paragraphs had turned into about 2 paragraphs, and they're buried in the middle of chapter 4. They're not at all the beginning of the book, but they were the moment when I found my voice. And so, yeah, I would encourage you to go ahead and write whatever you want, and part of that process is finding it. For my voice, it was really keen on having this storytelling aspect. Your voice may be different. Your voice may involve more natural imagery or other kinds of imagery. It may, who knows? And the best way to find your voice is to play around. So thanks for asking. Hope that answered. Any other questions or comments? Stories about stories. Okay, if not, let's look at some of the research that I've done into how storytelling has played out in our national history. And I want to focus on the National Park Service. As all of us know, in Montana, Yellowstone was the first national park in 1872. There were a couple more national parks, a few more collected over the next 20 or 30 years. But it wasn't until the 1916, that the National Park Service as an agency started. And there was a real hero involved in the formation of that agency, and his name was Steve Mather. And I think one of the big buildings in Yellowstone, I believe, is named after Mather, memorializing him. Steve Mather was, when he entered government service, was already a millionaire. By today's standards, he was probably a billionaire, certainly 1%. And his career had been in borax. I had to look up what actually is borax. It's a mineral that's mined in the desert, used in a lot of cleaning and kitchen and bathroom tasks. These days, it's just sort of incorporated into the products that you buy on the shelf. But back then, you would just have a box of borax sitting in your pantry, and you would use it for various purposes. And Steve Mather was a fantastic salesman. He made borax fun. He had contests for people to explain how they had creative uses for borax. He he had this whole ad campaign around the 20 mule team borax, because his company's mine was in the middle of Death Valley. And in order to get the stuff out, they had to have a wagon with 20 mules pulling it over 100 miles or so. And a lot of what they were pulling was just water to feed the horses to pull the wagon with the borax on it. But 20 mule team borax, that was such a fantastic story. We have a hero, the borax miner. He has a goal, getting borax to the people, and he has these obstacles of getting it out of the desert. Mather turned that into a story that he used in his advertising and marketing, and people bought 20 mule team borax rather than some other brand of borax, even though they were all the same thing, just because they loved his story. And so he was able to take this talent and apply it to the national parks. And under his leadership of the Park Service from 1916 to 28 or so, he really pushed storytelling in the Park Service. The best man at his wedding many years previously, Robert Sterling Yard, had had a career in journalism. He was also a born storyteller. Mather hired Yard, actually paid him out of his own pocket because the government wouldn't fund Yard. Mather paid him to write stories about the parks. And Yard could write really fast, and he would just generate all sorts of stories, send them to newspapers all around the country about the wonders of our national parks. And the newspapers would run them. He wrote up stories for legislators to encourage them to increase the budget of the Park Service. Mather also tended to look at things as stories. Every time he saw an event, he saw it as a potential story. Every time he saw a park, he said, well, what is this park's story? And one of the relatively unique things he did for his time 100 years ago was to tell those stories directly to the people, to have Yard talking to the newspapers and directly to the people, rather than only to the legislators or only to his boss, the president. So Mather brought storytelling to the Park Service. And of course, for most of the 20th century, even arguably today, the Park Service has been one of our most popular government agencies. Often when we think of government employees, we're like, oh, bureaucrats, but Park Service rangers. So his success has really lasted for over a century here. Some of the examples of the stories that Mather pushed. One of my favorites is the national park idea. According to this story, some of the explorers in Yellowstone in 1870 had, this party was mostly from Helena, and they'd come down through Gardner and wandered through the park and seen all of its wonders. And they came out by West Yellowstone, and they had one final night camped at the junction of the Madison and Firehole rivers, even today known as Madison Junction, what's about 10 miles east of West Yellowstone. And they were camped there, and they were just recalling all the wonders that they'd seen over the last couple of weeks. And they said, wow, we need to do something. We're the first white people to see this, to experience this. People are going to come after us and really just love it. We should, maybe, and someone said, maybe we should file homestead claims next to Old Faithful, next to the canyon, so that we can own these places. And someone else said, maybe we should just all go in on a lottery and we'll collectively own these things, and the 20 of us can make a fortune at this. And a fellow named Cornelius Hedges said, no, this natural beauty isn't something that that we should get rich off of personally. This is something that really belongs to the nation as a whole, and we need to figure out a way to keep this as a national park. And so this was the birth of the national park idea. And Steve Mather loved this story, and he made sure that everyone in the Park Service told this story as often as possible. It became sort of the founding mythology of the Park Service. In the same way that a software company has its founding story of some guy in a garage noodling around. The Park Service had this founding story of Cornelius Hedges saying, we don't want individual riches out of this. This is a more national, patriotic tie to nature. Mather pushed and pushed and pushed this story. 30, 40 years later, historians came along and said, you know, this story isn't necessarily true. Nobody wrote about this episode in their diaries at the time. It was only 20 years later that Nathaniel Langford wrote down the story of what had happened at Madison Junction. And so, you know, I mean, maybe Langford suddenly remembered what had gone on, or maybe he was romanticizing a little bit. There are plenty of other evidences of people coming up with the idea of national parks before Hedges articulated it. And there's plenty of, and his articulation of it was maybe a little bit more vague than what was actually executed. So the historians get in and say, well, you know, yeah, this story isn't really true. You know, that software guy actually didn't spend much time in his garage. He had plenty of venture capital behind him from the start. But whether or not we get bogged down in the facts, Mather's genius was to recognize a good story and to push it as an origin story for his agency. Mather also got the opportunity to tell that story. For example, places that he told that story were at events. In 1922, Mather was, directing this still relatively new agency, about 6 years old, and yet Yellowstone itself was celebrating its 50th birthday. And so he set up a big event for the 50th birthday, an anniversary celebration. And we see that in the upper left photo. He brought back one of the explorers. He actually wasn't able to get one of the explorers from that 1870 expedition, but one who had been there the year previously and was still alive and kicking and willing to take a trip. So on the far left, we have Horace Albright, the superintendent of Yellowstone. In the middle, we have the explorer whose name is escaping me. I can tell you all about him. He was from White Sulphur Springs and had continued to live there. His name will probably come to me as soon as I stop worrying about it. And on the right, we have, I believe her name is Anne Applebaum, from the National Press Club. She was basically organizing a bunch of reporters to come out to Yellowstone on a junket, which guaranteed then that they would write about the story that Mather had them tell. They are sitting right there at the junction of the Gibbon and Firehole Rivers, Madison Junction, where the national park idea had been born. And Mather was determined to get that message through there. As I recall, this explorer, whose name I'm forgetting, hadn't actually been to this location. He'd gone in and out through Gardner and hadn't seen anything significant at Madison Junction. But hey, we've got an artifact of those times, and we have this great story from those times. Let's tell that story. In the lower picture, we have another opportunity to tell this story. This is during the construction of the little museum that's located at Madison Junction. Some of you may have been there. It's sort of more of a visitor center now, but you coming in from West Yellowstone, you go past the campground, and there's this pretty little building that has a wonderful view across the meadows at the confluence there. Last time I was there, they didn't have a lot of content in the building. I think they had some children's activities. And the problem is that the building had originally been dedicated as a museum to the story of the birth of the national park idea, this story that Steve Mather loved. And then once the historians pointed out that it wasn't really true, you can't have that story in a museum. And so now you have this pretty building that doesn't really tell much of a story. There's three men standing in front of it. One of them is the scientist who had pushed the whole idea of having a bunch of mini museums all around Yellowstone to tell stories adjacent places. So they had one at Old Faithful that's since been replaced. There's another gorgeous one at Fishing Bridge. They had one at Mammoth, I believe, and I'm blanking out on the other one. But anyways, there are all these rustic, really cool old museums. The fellow in the middle is from the Rockefeller Foundation. He funded those museums, and the fellow on the right is the architect who had designed them. And they're standing in front of the construction of the ultimate one, because Mather was able to link this special place to his favorite story. And indeed, in the 1920s and 30s, people would come to Yellowstone and they would want to see, you know, those top 5 places. They would want to see Old Faithful. They would want to see the canyon. They would want to see the Mammoth Hot Springs, and they would want to see the Madison Junction Meadows, the birth of the national park. Because this story that had barely been known before the 19 teens, it had been sort of dormant for 30 or 40 years. Steve Mather's storytelling abilities enabled it to become one of the founding stories of Yellowstone and thus of the Park Service. All right, you still with me? I see people sort of, seems like you're paying attention. That's great. Let me move on to a different federal agency, the U.S. Forest Service. And this is a picture of Gifford Pinchot. If you haven't heard of Gifford Pinchot, don't worry. My literary agent hadn't heard of Pinchot either. She said, when I told her about the book Natural Rivals, she said, Pinochet? And I said, no, there's no Chilean dictators involved in the life of John Muir. This is Gifford Pinchot, the founder, widely known as the founder of the Forest Service. Well, usually I can tell because people either laugh or don't laugh at my jokes, and you guys are all muted, so hopefully that joke landed successfully. So Pinchot, in addition to his role founding the U.S. Forest Service, or as part of that role, he was a key advisor to Theodore Roosevelt during Roosevelt's presidency from 1901 to 1908 or 9. And he and Roosevelt were very much cut from the same cloth. They were wealthy. They came from old money in New York. And yet they didn't want to devote themselves to business, to making more money. They had plenty of money. They wanted to devote themselves to statesmanship. And so they gave away money. They ran for public office or served in public service. And Pinchot was advising Roosevelt on all sorts of environmental ideas, and that's probably, of course, Roosevelt's greatest legacy. So really, although not widely known today, Pinchot was really a fairly influential person in his time. And he's most famous for the Forest Service because of the way he set it up so successfully. And that depended a lot on the stories that he told. Like Steve Mather 15 years later, Pinchot in the mid-aughts would tell stories of the value of forestry to local newspapers. He would bypass all of the functionaries in Washington, D.C. and just go straight to the people and say, this is why forestry is so cool. This is why we need national forests. Indeed, at that time, there was fear that we would run out of trees to cut down. Earlier in the 1800s, logging companies had cut down all the trees in the upper Midwest. They'd cut down a lot of trees just sort of marching west. They were headed for the Pacific Northwest. And boy, what if we don't have any wood? Our economy depends so much on wood. We need to sustain it. And Pinchot was really big on this sustainability goal. He could also talk about it in very personal terms. He would talk about how he'd grown up loving to fish, how that really was his best connection with his father when they would go camping and fishing together in the woods. And he would talk about it also with the sort of obligation he felt, because the source of his family's wealth had been that his grandfather had moved to Northwest Pennsylvania back in the early 1800s and chopped down every tree in sight. And Pinchot, as a teenager, had actually participated in some of these logging operations, and he now felt like oh my gosh, have I sort of killed these forests that I love? How can I then turn my personal story into one of redemption where I can help save forests for other people? And he was very eloquent at talking about that, and that was a source of his popularity. Again, to give an example of some of the stories that Pinchot told, a very vivid scene that I found in Denver in June of 1907, where Pinchot was speaking at a convention at the Broadway Theater and Metropole Hotel, the largest hotel in Denver at the time. And it was a convention that had been called by some politicians in Colorado. Some ranchers and loggers were especially concerned about Pinchot's and Roosevelt's despotism. Roosevelt, as you may recall, set aside lots and lots of public lands, put lots and lots of lands into the national forests, created the first wildlife refuges, expanded the park system. And business people were a little bit concerned that he was doing this, that he was maybe a little too ambitious, maybe not involving Congress as much as he should. He was a little bit sort of a Lone Ranger in that sense. And so Congress had decided, yeah, you're going a little too fast. And they passed a law that said that he would need to stop sort of making these individual declarations. And they put that law as a rider on a budget bill that he couldn't really veto. And so he looked at the bill and he decided he was going to sign it. But in the moments before he signed it, he would set aside a whole bunch of forest reserves that it would preclude him from doing in the future. So basically, anything he would want to set aside over the next 3 to 5 years, he's just going to set aside tonight before midnight when he signs the law that will prohibit him from doing that. And Pinchot did a whole bunch of research to set those boundaries, and he and Roosevelt had really been responsible for this action, which, if you like the environment, this was a great heroic action to save forests from being cut or being overgrazed. If you are more free enterprise oriented, this is a horrible sort of underhanded midnight reserve technique that smacks of despotism. And they could tell that Pinchot was really sort of pulling the strings behind the scene, and they started talking about Pinchotism. And so Pinchot is standing in this convention in front of all these people who are all fired up about this. And he starts telling his personal stories about how he felt about the woods, about how he felt about his family, and about what he was trying to do for the nation. You talk about people that you would have loved to meet in history. And I wrote this book about Pinchot and John Muir, and John Muir, clearly a fascinating person. I would love to meet him in person. But I would also love to meet Pinchot because he had a certain magnetism that ended up persuading that entire crowd that, didn't persuade him that he was correct, but did persuade them that he was not evil, that he was trying to do his best, and that the convention had a platform that they wanted to pass that would condemn his actions, and that ended up being considerably weakened by the time the convention ended. This convention could have been a big sort of spark for a revolution against Pinchot and Roosevelt, and it ended up just sort of fizzling out, in my opinion, thanks primarily to Pinchot's storytelling abilities as he stood on that podium in front of the convention. The National Forest system really got a big benefit from a real tragedy, the Big Blowup, the huge wildfires that consumed the Montana-Idaho border in 1910. As I say, it was a tragedy. There was so much loss of trees, of ecosystems, of buildings, of people. But there were also great heroic stories, and Pinchot was able to see some of those stories. For example, a forest ranger named Ed Pulaski in Idaho was able to save the lives of his fire crew. And Pinchot and other storytellers really grabbed hold of the Pulaski story. It's not clear whether Ed Pulaski invented the Pulaski tool or whether he used it. But this tool that is so commonly used in trail building and other forestry tasks to this day, I've done some volunteer trail work over the last few years, and I'm always swinging a Pulaski. It's no coincidence that it's named after a hero of this huge event, the forest fire that showed why we needed national forests, why we needed them to do firefighting. And so that story really shaped that organization. Some might say to its detriment these days, as Forest Service budgets are increasingly consumed in firefighting, but that's the Forest Service origin story, right? That's where it gained its power, was in valiantly fighting that wild 1910 fire. So these are some of the ways that stories, I think that's my last one on Forest Service. There we go. Yeah, these are some of the ways that stories have shaped individual agencies. But as I looked at these stories, I thought, when we think about public lands today, we don't necessarily think about agencies. We don't think about Park Service versus Forest Service. We think about public lands. Public lands are a big political issue these days, and without getting into one side or the other, we're typically talking about public lands collectively, whether they should be reinforced and celebrated, whether they should be sort of relaxed and decreased in size. We're not saying specifically, well, Park Service or specifically BLM or specifically Forest Service. We're tending to apply these ideologies to all of public lands on both sides. So where are the stories of the founding of public lands in general? Where is that origin story? We all know that Yellowstone was the first national park. Where was the first national forest in the world? I should have waited and, showed only part of this slide so that you wouldn't be able to read the answer on your screen. The world's first national forest was right next to the world's first national park. And there's plenty of people right here in Red Lodge, just a few miles away, even people in Cody, who aren't fully aware of that and what it means. 1891, long before Gifford Pinchot gets on the scene. He's still in college, graduate school at this point. The real hero of the Yellowstone Park Timberland Reserve, as it was called back then, was a geologist named Arnold Hague. Hague was a geologist assigned to Yellowstone to look at the geysers and the other thermal features and explain them from the perspective of the U.S. Geological Survey. And he got really excited about lots of stories in Yellowstone. He loved following elk. He said that elk trails always took him to very scenic places. They seemed to have a great appreciation of scenery. And he explored all over the Yellowstone ecosystem and concluded that much of the best elk habitat and a lot of the great wild lands were actually east and south of the park. And for years, he and some of his colleagues tried to sponsor bills in Congress to expand the park and failed. But in 1891, Congress passed a law that allowed the president to set aside timber reserves because of this fear that we might run out of timber. And Haig said, well, let's do the first one in Yellowstone. Let's set this land aside. Practically nobody lived there at that point, so let's set this land aside now. And they did set it aside. Lots of implementation problems with that brand new idea. The whole concept sort of limped along for about 14 years until Pinchot was able to organize the Forest Service. But still, it's a fascinating story with a great setting. Why don't we tell that story? That's what I started diving into as I was writing about Pinchot and John Muir. I'd come across an account of Pinchot and Muir camped on Lake McDonald in what is now Glacier National Park in 1896, 15 years before it became a national park. John Muir, many people are probably more familiar with Muir than with Pinchot, founder of the Sierra Club, protector of Yosemite National Park, wonderful nature writer, wonderful wanderer, would just go off in the woods for days or weeks at a time. And sort of a great spiritualist, was really convinced a lot of his contemporaries to look to nature for the spiritual fulfillment that many people get from religion. We often today see Muir's ideas as opposed to Pinchot's ideas. Muir is about preservation, preserving lands untouched. Pinchot is about conservation, using resources wisely and sustainably. And so how can you, what do you do with any given piece of land? When I heard about them camped together on Lake McDonald, I wondered if they were arguing. Maybe Pinchot was pointing, see, we could cut those trees over there first, and we could put the dam here, and that would flood the valley and it'd be great drinking water for Kalispell. And Muir would be like, no, don't touch any of it. It's sacred. And so I was like, great, I'm gonna write a book about this argument. And what I found actually was that they didn't argue. They both loved nature. They both appreciated the crisis that the nation was facing in terms of vanishing pieces of nature. And they saw that by collaborating behind public lands, we could have public lands for people to argue about 125 years later. So here's Muir and Pinchot. In a sense, when they were there on the shores of Lake McDonald on behalf of this committee called the National Forest Commission, they were doing the work of collaboratives. I don't know if any of you folks are involved in natural resource work these days. A lot of national forests, for example, have collaborative groups where they try and get people from various constituencies to sit down in a room and see if they can find common ground. The technique has been used by land use planning departments and all sorts of government agencies in many sectors. And this is one of the great examples of it happening years and years ago and succeeding surprisingly well. Because although we tend to talk about Muir versus Pinchot and their differing viewpoints, in fact, as they sat there in nature, they were able to find their commonalities, their love of this scenery, their love of woods and trees and ecosystems, although that word hadn't been invented yet, but of the way all that worked together and the benefits that brought to society and the value of holding this land collectively, of our democratic government holding it collectively for the people as public lands. And so that's the story that I tried to tell in Natural Rivals, a sort of origin story for public lands in general, rather than simply for the Park Service or the Forest Service. But that was sort of based on my own journey and the obstacles I was overcoming in terms of seeing the relationship between John Muir and Gifford Pinchot. I'd sort of at this point like to invigorate a discussion, turn it over to you guys, and we can go in whatever direction you'd like. Maybe you want to talk about what public land is or what it means to you. Maybe you want to talk about stories of public land, or maybe you want to talk about stories in general. Where are the stories that really drive you, and how those work, whether or not they intersect with public land. So at this point, Sarah, maybe you can unmute everybody, right? And we can
Yeah, I can do that.
have a conversation. Let me turn off my screen share so that we can let whoever's speaking talk.
Go ahead,
Go for it,
Jennifer. Yeah.
Oh wait, I'm just curious. I'm from the Washington D.C. area, and I live in California. I don't remember seeing so much about public lands as I do here in Montana, and I'm just curious. I don't know. Did I miss something in California? Did you ever? I see people wearing T-shirts here about public lands. I know there's a lot of discussion about public lands here in Montana versus anywhere else I've lived. You?
I've also camped in Utah and Colorado and Bureau of Land Management with BLM land, but I think there's more of it in this area than
maybe
the California and the highly populated East Coast.
Oh.
I certainly agree. A lot of my friends and relatives on the East Coast are a little bit confused about the notion of public lands. The editor of the book wanted to include the word wilderness in the title of the book because people really respond to wilderness. And I said, yeah, that's great, but it's about public lands. And in my opinion, one of the reasons that public lands don't ring out as effectively in the Eastern California is that they don't have these origin stories. That people know national parks and National Park Service because Mather was so good at telling those origin stories. Some people know national forests, but they don't think of public lands. And it turns out that public lands also have this really cool origin story.
So I think it's really interesting. I have a art background, and in my art history classes in college, the story is a little different. I think what's interesting is the same event can be told to whatever interested party, wants to tell it or wants to hear it. And it can be, a draw to a lot of people. So, the story I remember is Thomas Moran, the painter, painted, a lot of the beautiful imagery that couldn't be captured with the black and white photography, but the color stood out, the yellow of the Yellowstone and that kind of thing. And then also, I don't remember who, told this part or who this happened to. It might have been Moran, and I think the photographer was Jackson. But how they were fishing and they could put their hook in one side of Lake Yellowstone and then flip their fish over to the other part and cook it because of the sulfur, there. So, anyway, I think it's really interesting because I sort of, hearing about this presentation kind of had that in my repertoire, like that's going to be what we hear about. But, then it's completely new perspective. And, I can appreciate that as well.
But I'm glad you spoke up. I think the Moran story is a huge component of Yellowstone. And I think that highlights exactly what we're talking about, the power of storytelling, that depending on which hero you choose and which obstacles she's facing, you can have totally different views of how we came to something. And I think this is just, you know, we see it so much today in all of the political struggles that we have, where facts matter less than stories. And again, I don't mean to be criticizing one side or another. I think it works on both sides. People tell stories about the cause or the ideology that they really care about, and those stories tend to carry a lot of weight, regardless of the facts behind them. And so, if you and I were arguing about why Yellowstone was important, you would be talking about art, and I might be talking about political leaders, and we're both right? We both have great stories. I actually told a lot of the Thomas Moran story in Wonder Landscape. I came up with 10 different stories of why Yellowstone is so incredible. Stories that sort of took turns. First, it was Moran. You know, in the 1870s, when Moran was painting, there wasn't a lot of wildlife. Moran's diaries are like, biscuits for dinner again. They had hunters with them to go kill animals to feed the party, and they couldn't find any animals to kill. Can you imagine, in Yellowstone? Only in the 1890s did Yellowstone become known as a wildlife sanctuary, probably because wildlife was then less and less prevalent elsewhere. You know, in the 1870s, you could find bison all over the place on the road to Yellowstone. You didn't need to go to Yellowstone to find them. By the late 1890s, that's the only place bison basically were in the country. And so these stories end up being how we remember a park like Yellowstone, a place, a time, an idea. And these stories can change over time with the culture's values. So yeah, I do want to affirm Moran is a great story and essential to Yellowstone. Other thoughts?
Thanks for a really good talk. I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about how you did the historical research for your books. How do you know how to do that? Is there special training, or where'd you start?
No, I had no training. I figured this stuff out. You know, I do a lot of work on the internet. Obviously, you can't believe everything you read on the internet. You have to have the skepticism to understand when you have a good source. There's an awful lot of books from the 1800s that have been digitized. And so a lot of the reports from this National Forest Commission that Muir and Pinchot were involved in were there. And I was very fortunate with this latest book that all of John Muir's letters and journals have been digitized and put on the internet for all of us to read. So I was able to get those original firsthand sources of Muir and his correspondence by just sitting here in my office in Red Lodge. I was very fortunate for this book to get a fellowship from Gray Towers, which is the Pinchot family mansion in Pennsylvania, now owned by the Forest Service. And so I got to spend a week in the Pinchot archives in the Library of Congress, and then at this mansion where they have several other resources. So that was a big part of that research. And then, you know, just a bunch of books and trolling through libraries and you just sort of. I'm curious. I like to find things out, and yeah, to me the research is obvious. To me the work comes in crafting the story, in finding that who am I going to have as my hero? What are his obstacles or her obstacles? What is their goal? And yet other people say that you know, the reviews often talk about my research, and I'm like, I don't know. To me, the storytelling was
Thanks.
Yeah. Other thoughts about stories?
Oh, sorry to put one of the audience members on the spot, but I know they do a lot of collaborative things with different groups and bringing them together. And I wondered if there was a story that could be shared about that process and like what that looks like for something maybe more local to Montana, Bozeman area specifically. Would you mind?
Yes.
Tyler.
Specifically.
Sorry.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, I just I'm wondering if you could share like an anecdotal story about a collaborative project where a bunch of different groups are coming together and how you kind of go about that and what's looked at and what's ignored and how do you determine the goals, and is it just like based on the project or is it a bigger picture kind of thing?
Oh man.
Sorry.
That's a hard one. I'm an ecologist by way of explanation. I work for a conservation nonprofit in town. We focus specifically on connectivity, so keeping landscapes connected so animals can move between different parks. I'm definitely more on the scientific research side, but we do have a lot of folks at our organization that work specifically on kind of the people side of conservation. And yeah, it's incredibly complex because there's so many different jurisdictions that an animal walks through, getting from one place to another, that you kind of have to solve all the pieces of the puzzle at once to successfully conserve like a wildlife corridor or something like that. I'm not sure I have great insights on the people side, though. I'm mostly behind a computer running models, so yeah.
The way it prompts me to tell a story, though, if you'd like. The way I got into this book project was I started with this potential clash between Muir and Pinchot, and I went to the Montana Quarterly magazine and I said, "Can we do something about this?" And Scott McMillian, the editor, and I agreed that what would be really interesting would be to see how Muir's and Pinchot's philosophies are playing out in Montana today. And so I interviewed a bunch of conservation professionals about, preservation, conservation, is there conflict, where is it, and what might Muir and Pinchot think if they encounter the situation today. And I spoke with some folks up in Whitefish, and the details are gonna escape me, but they had engaged in this collaborative effort where a bunch of different people came into a room in order to try to advise the Forest Service on what they should do for their forest plan for that particular, I think it's the Flathead Forest up there. And surprisingly, they had actually, the loggers and the miners and the bicyclists and the hikers had all come together and agreed on certain things, including the potential for some new wilderness areas. And one of the organizers said, "You would not believe how much hard work this is. Please do not de-emphasize in any way that collaboration takes incredible amounts of work." And that's when I realized that while Muir and Pinchot were camping on Lake McDonald, it wasn't all just beauty and fishing. They were really working through their stories and figuring out how to connect their stories. And this one woman I was interviewing, I said to her, "So have you found that there's a particularly good way to get people in a more collaborative mood?" And she immediately said, "Get them out in nature." And so I realized that Muir and Pinchot camping on Lake McDonald was a big part of the story. If they had been meeting in a meeting room in Washington, D.C., or in Pinchot's mansion, or somewhere else, that they might not have been able to find that common ground as easily. Is that the kind of anecdote you were looking for, Sarah?
Yes, thank you.
Good, but again, I don't mean to dominate discussion. I'm delighted when these things take on a life of their own, if you guys have other stories or perspectives to share or work through, you can do that. Or if not, are there other questions, comments? Thank you all so much for my first Zoom presentation. Technology worked better than I expected.
Yeah, me too. For which I'm grateful. No, we enjoyed having you, and I think I learned a lot. I was taking notes, so thank you. I'm looking forward to reading your books. And I know, John, you said you had a slide, like a final slide, so I will reshare with you. Or are you good?
No, I thought I had a slide about Humanities Montana.
Oh, okay.
But I actually forgot to put it in this. And the technology has ceased doing what we want. So
okay.
Let's just say thank you, and been great to meet you all virtually.
Yeah. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Bye.